All right, I think we will begin. So welcome everybody to today's webinar on success planning. Over the next hour, we're going to have a variety of live speakers and a video that's going to go over Education Redesign Lab success planning framework. So before we start, just a few of the virtual housekeeping pieces that I'm sure many of you are all familiar with over the past year. First, all of you are going to be muted to limit the background noise. If you have any tech support needs, you can use the chat function and message Jaspel. For the questions, please submit them through the Q&A function, and you can do that throughout the entire webinar, and then we're going to answer them all at once at the end. We are recording today's session, and I'm sure it'll be posted somewhere, and we'll share with that later. And then live captioning is also available. So there should be a CC button at the bottom of your screen that you can use to do that. So this is actually the first of a series of webinars on success planning. Today's objective is just to give the rationale and the framework for the navigator-based success planning. The subsequent ones are going to be more on how you operationalize and implement the actual framework, but today we want to give you the big picture. So for our agenda, we're going to start by understanding the challenges that we're seeking to solve. Then we're going to hear from our keynote speaker, Karen Pittman. She's going to talk about the importance of relationships for children's success. Then Paul Revel, the founder and director of the Education Redesign Lab. He's going to share an introduction to the lab, the vision, and the framework for success planning. Then we'll try to frame this work as part of the solution for post-pandemic reality and at a time of national racial reckoning. Then we're going to have a video featuring some of our success planning partners from across the country. They're going to explain 5 of our 10 guiding principles. And then we'll wrap up with a Q&A, hopefully about 15 minutes or so for that. I'm going to be your MC throughout the session. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lynn Sachs. She's Education Redesign Lab's research director. And Lynn is going to share some of the evidence behind the success planning framework.
Thank you, Daniela. There are 2 things we know matter a lot for kids' well-being and success: having trusting relationships with adults and access to a wide range of supports and services. We have research evidence to support this, and we also know it from our own experiences as parents, as teachers, and even from our own childhoods. But too many kids feel disconnected and anonymous in schools and face barriers to accessing supports and opportunities, especially those living in poverty, those with learning differences and other disabilities, and English learners. We need to make sure that every kid has access to healthcare, after-school enrichment, academic supports, and social services. If you can, yep, and next one. What if every child had an individual plan for success, ensuring she has what she needs to flourish in her life? We'll be exploring in more depth throughout this webinar. And to get us started in that, we're fortunate to have Karen Pittman joining us to share her expertise on the importance of relationships and supports for children. And just by way of introduction, Karen Pittman is currently a senior fellow and formerly the president and CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment, a national action tank that combines thought leadership on youth development, youth policy, cross-system and cross-sector partnerships, and developmental youth practice with on-the-ground training, technical assistance, and supports. Prior to co-founding the Forum, Karen launched adolescent pregnancy prevention initiatives at the Children's Defense Fund, started the Center for Youth Development and Policy Research, and served as senior vice president at the International Youth Foundation. She was involved in the founding of America's Promise and directed the President's Crime Prevention Council during the Clinton administration. She also served on the Aspen Institute's National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, which is a national effort to unite leaders to re-envision what constitutes success in our schools. Karen, we're thrilled to have you with us and appreciate your time today to give us a foundation for this work.
Great, thanks. I'm glad to be here. I don't even think I need a whole 10 minutes, so we can have plenty of time for Q&A. But as we come into this conversation about the importance of relationships, you had a quote from my colleague, David Osher, up about the importance of relationships, and the SOLD Alliance and the Forum for Youth Investment is one of the managing governing partners of the SOLD Alliance, which is the Science of Learning and Development. That includes the American Institutes for Research and Turnaround for Children and the Learning Policy Institute as well. And looking at all of the research, brain research, multidisciplinary research on how learning happens, the conclusion was learning and development are driven by relationships and experiences. Again, not rocket science, but a whole lot of science brings us to that conclusion. And one of the things that was really, really important to do, and this was beginning to happen in the Seed Commission, was to really ask, what are the non-negotiables? Now, we've ended up in this graphic calling them the essential guiding principles, but for 2 years, I've just been calling them the non-negotiables because it gets people's attention. If we really want to optimize learning and development and whatever kind of settings we're creating, formal, flexible, informal learning settings, we have to do 5 things. We have to lead with making sure we're creating positive developmental relationships. We have to make sure that the environments are filled with safety and belonging, which means that we have to ask young people if they feel safe and if they belong. And it was really important for us to separate the idea of relationships from the idea of belonging, since that's a very personal experience. And I can think I've made a great relationship with you, but if I don't ask you about whether the whole context is one in which you feel safe and supported, I'm going to miss a piece. Once we have those 2 pieces going, it's really then important to add in those rich experiences and knowledge development. And that's academic. It's in any way that we want. The challenge is an important part of learning and development because the main thing we want young people to do is to make meaning. The way they make meaning is to continue to develop their skills, their habits, their mindsets, all of those things that the Seed Commission was so, important about making sure we're integrating those into everything. But as Lynn said, behind all this, we have to have the assurance that there's some kind of integrated support systems, that there are mechanisms for making sure that as we get to know young people and we find out that they need things, we actually have to have some capacity to help them get those things. Whether we're dealing with food insecurity or housing or mental health needs or academic support needs, or just needs for more interest-driven opportunities that get them motivated and engaged. Whatever those integrated things are, we've got to have the capacity to do that. So this idea of really every setting and every system tends to lead with one of these, right? So we think of schools as leading with rich learning experiences, primarily academic. But what we've learned so much from the science is that if those other things are in the red, you won't optimize learning. So that's why I like to call them non-negotiables. Everybody doesn't have to lead with all of them, but getting every set of adults who are working with young people to recognize that these really are the core elements of creating a learning context, and that if any of them are in the red, you're not going to get to optimal learning, no matter what your goal was. Means that we have a common base for people to really be able to come together and recognize how they support young people in more of this whole child, whole community way. So if you go to the next slide, let's dig in on what we mean by developmental relationships. All of us understand that relationships start with caring, but the Search Institute, which gave us the 40 developmental assets 4 years ago, has really come back to zoom in on this question of relationships. Again, as the science tells us that relationships really are the drivers of getting to experiences so that we really are getting to learning and growth. And so what they've done through a series of research over the past 8 years is to really dig in and create something called the developmental relationships framework, in which they basically say, yes, relationships start with care, but developmental relationships, relationships that are really supporting young people's learning and development, don't just stop with care. They challenge growth, they provide support, and then the last 2 things are hard. They share power. At some point, if you're going to help young people develop, you have to step back and let them step forward. And then they intentionally expand possibilities. All of these lead very naturally to your idea that you're going to talk about for the rest of the session about what navigators are going to do. These are all important things. But a navigator can't just come in to say, I'm going to help you expand possibilities unless they start with the others. So the blue wheel are non-negotiables. Then we dig into this idea of developmental relationships. There's a really robust set of research and there are tools behind this. There are 20 specific actions that the Search Institute has really sort of put together to help people profile what does it really mean to do all these things. And they've also done research asking young people whether they're getting these things from adults. And not surprisingly, what you find is that what adults think they're doing and what young people think they're doing are not always the same. So just reinforcing, if we're really going to be developing relationships in which we can expand possibilities, we have to be asking young people whether what we think we're doing is actually being experienced by them. The last slide is one that I've actually been playing back and forth with Paul and other colleagues, because we're really getting to this idea that if we're going to do anything, what we call it whole child, youth development, whatever, if we're really going to support young people's growth and development and success in a holistic way, we need people who need to know much more about the kids. You can't just come in saying, I'm going to work with you on X. I actually have to know you better. And I have to know the community better in order to really help you navigate in a responsible way. So the question is, what needs to happen? What allows us to happen in between the obvious if we don't have some basic coordination to make sure that there's really access to quality services? We're going to be limited when we want young people to explore and expand possibilities. If we don't get more intentional about having these navigators who are going to get to know young people and help them decide and think about what they need, we're going to miss things. But in between, the question is, what do those navigators need to have? And so this is just a quick suggestion that as we really think about these bookends of working at the community level, at the city level, to make sure we're getting coordinated supports and services, and we're thinking about policies and resource alignment, and then working at that individual student level to make sure that we're getting to know the student well enough and developing that relationship so that they trust us enough to tell us what's going on. That navigator is then going to need site level support. Somebody that's thinking up about who those partners could be so they don't have to go out and look for them. That site coordinator is going to be better off if we really have system level staff who are working to connect systems together. And then all of that means that we need coordination, not just inside of our schools, but with our overall communities. So this is just a reminder that as we're talking about these two bookend things, everything gets better if we're really pushing this idea of sort of 360 coordination up and thinking about what it is, not just that kids need, but what the navigators are going to need in order to make sure that they're getting to what they need. And all of that then depends on relationships, bigger and broader relationships between adults who have different roles. So that's a quick sort of tour through what we mean by relationships and why developmental relationships are not only good for kids, but they're critical for the navigators.
I think you're muted, Paul.
Thank you so much, Karen. Sorry about that being on mute. We are so fortunate to have such a prominent national thought leader who has distinguished herself in her experience and framing of this work for all of us in this field. And she's been doing it for decades. So we're thrilled to have you with us. And thank you so much, Karen, for joining us. We look forward to talking with you when we get together in the question and answer period, in the panel period. Again, I'm Paul Rebel. I founded and direct the Education and Redesign Lab with lots of colleagues who are present on today's call. We were created, half a dozen, 7 years ago, out of a concern that our school reform efforts were not going anywhere near as far as we'd hoped they would go. We had slogans like all means all, no child left behind, and so on and so forth. I spent a lot of time leading reform efforts in Massachusetts, and 25, now 30 years in, we've still made only modest progress at our very ambitious goals of preparing all children to be ready to be successful in a 21st century economy and democracy. And so we took a step back with some humility and started to pay much closer attention to what people like Karen have been saying for some time, which was it was going to take a more holistic approach, that a 20% of children's time spent in school was just on average an insufficient intervention to pave the way to success for all children, and in particular to knock down barriers caused by poverty, by racism, by marginalization of one kind or another. and that unless we did a broader, bolder approach that some had been advocating for a number of years, and I had a chance to chair that coalition for a while, and figured out how to do it by redesigning our child development and education system, that we would never be successful with exclusively a school optimization approach. So we founded an education redesign lab that was designed to do advocacy, change the national conversation, work on policy, to do a certain amount of field work. And we work with communities all across the United States on things like children's cabinets and the success planning that we're talking about today. And then doing a deep body of research, documenting our work, documenting the work of others, and highlighting examples of success and creating toolkits and roadmaps to doing effective work. So let's go to the next slide, please. Our vision of a revitalized, repurposed 21st century system of child development and education has a core central principle, and this is meet children where they are in early childhood and give them what they need inside and outside of school in order to be successful, not only in their trajectory through the education system, but ultimately in attaining a job in a high skill, high knowledge environment that will allow them to support themselves and a family, should they choose to have one, to be leaders in our democracy, to be heads of families, should they choose that, and lifelong fulfilled learners. So we were positing the redesign of a much more interconnected system of working with youth, that schools alone were not going to be sufficient to get the job of all means all done. And so that was the basic founding premise. Next slide, please. Success planning has been particularly important to us well before actually the pandemic. And as we'll talk about later, I think we have a particular moment here to break the back of one of the fundamentally flawed paradigms that organizes our education system, which is one size fits all. Our 21st century education system was founded in the early 20th century based on a factory model, which was quite popular at that time, in an economy that required an overwhelming majority of people to have only low skill, low knowledge education. As we've moved into the late 20th century, now the 21st, we realize we've got a goal of getting everybody to a level heretofore reserved for an elite few. And what we're going to have to do in order to get there is to individualize, to personalize, to meet people where they are and give them what they need, to recognize the differences in life experience, in assets and challenges facing each family and each child, and to make a conscious case management kind of effort to give these children what they need, to see them, to support them, to build relationships with them, and provide them with the supports and opportunities that they need to achieve at the levels of our most privileged youth in society. So the notion of success planning includes a 360-degree view of each child, 24/7, 365 days a year, from birth forward. It requires meaningful relationships between each student and somebody who's an advocate and navigator that we'll talk about as we roll forward. And that we ensure that these relationships that we're building in education aren't just luck of the draw, but they're meaningful relationships, they're ongoing relationships, they're broad relationships that take into account the family and circumstances and the differences that exist between each child, which after all was a fundamental premise of standards-based school reform, was not that you'd any longer count seat time, but you'd give each child what they needed to get to the standard. Next slide, please. So the key components in success planning are, keeping the equivalent of a running medical record, but in this case, a running child development record for each child, starting very early in childhood, that's holistic, that's diagnostic, and that contains an assessment and input from all the key actors and the child in terms of that child's well-being and success within the system, and then connects that to a navigator who can take action on the identified academic supports, health and human services that are needed, and enrichment activities. For example, opportunity. We sometimes think of this work as only having to do with supports, but it also has to do with what students do with that 80% of their waking hours outside of schools. We well know that affluent children have access to virtually 24/7 stimulation, whereas other children, by virtue of the circumstances and the economic and social capital they inherit, don't have that kind of access. So if we want to achieve No Child Left Behind, we're going to have to create a platform where that's possible for everyone. And it's a navigator that makes that kind of work possible as the advocate who takes the diagnostic success plan and works together with others in the school, in the community, to make it possible. And where those opportunities and supports aren't available and aren't funded, and we can't just reach that level through better collaboration and coordination, that we work hard through our children's cabinets and other mechanisms to attack the policy and budgetary decisions that marginalize people, that create everything from food deserts to mental health crises in our society. Finally, last of my slides, please. So success planning in this moment, where I think we've got this very special opportunity because the pandemic has put so much pressure on the system and on individuals that the gaps we had between students in a similar cohort have now gotten greater than ever before. And people all around the nation are experimenting with various degrees of this work. And so we're conscious of several, which you see listed here, experiments and work that are going on in this kind of, in this area. But these are just the tip of the iceberg. These are the ones that we're on top of and we're looking at. I might point to Nashville, for example, where that school system has adopted a navigator plan for all 25,000 plus students in that system. So it's catching fire because districts realize we can no longer teach to the average when some kids have had virtually everything by way of stimulation and support during the crisis, and others have had nothing and have fallen off the grid altogether. So we've got a very opportune moment to proceed, and we're sincerely hoping to continue to promote this approach and to take advantage of the opportunity that we have in the midst of this crisis. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Daniela.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. So with this slide, we just wanted to reiterate that this vision and framework that Paul just shared, it's not a plug and play program, but rather it's a customizable framework. There's 10 guiding principles that we're going to share in a little bit. Basically, we want the communities to develop partnerships that make sense for their children and families. If they're going to choose a data sharing platform, we know it has to agree with the systems that they already have in place. Just like we're talking about the navigators, you might have different kinds of navigators that are best for your student population. The same thing goes for the language. So you're going to hear in one of the videos from Unity Point School District in Illinois, they call their success planning work an ISSP, Individual Student Success Plan. In Oakland, their staff are part of a COST team, Coordination of Services team. Sometimes the adult's a navigator, sometimes it's a coach, sometimes it's a community school liaison. The semantics really don't matter, it's the functions that do. We also want to reiterate that success planning should include every sector of society and the community. So the healthcare sector, the business community, transportation industry, legal services, after school programs, families, and the list goes on, again, customizable to each community. The goal is that we're offering comprehensive array of services for each child and their families potentially. So whether it's bus rides or dental supports or tutoring or summer programs or healthy food access, housing stability. And we also know that it takes a lot of time to build all of these partnerships. So you can't start with everything all at once. It's okay to start with a few and then grow it from there. And just as Karen had mentioned, and Paul as well, many of the communities also develop a community-wide system of support. So like a children's cabinet or a city school coordinating body, something that's also pulling together and aligning the agencies and the services that are outside the school walls, because we know educators have enough on their plates without also having to find all of these services themselves. So timing is everything. We think that we are in a really powerfully unique time in American history to move this forward with the resources that, that we might actually need. So COVID was tragic and is tragic in almost always, but it did demonstrate one really clear lesson. Education, health, socioeconomic status, community well-being, they can't be separated. So many of the folks on this webinar, you guys have spent your entire careers trying to improve outcomes for young people. And you recognize that students of color, students from rural communities, students from immigrant families, low-income neighborhoods, they often face a whole host of different challenges before they even get into your classrooms. However, the whole country did not experience this in their day-to-day, either personal or professional lives. So this COVID brought out an opportunity to showcase and limelight these disparities in a way that hasn't happened before. So while schools closed across the country, we all know that every child did not have a house that they could safely reside in. They didn't have healthy food readily available. They didn't have internet to suddenly do virtual schooling. And many of them didn't have parents who could safely stay at home. We all saw in the daily news, right, images of families and kids in food pantry lines, or the numbers of kids that weren't able to log on to or be touched by a single teacher when things went virtual. This has resulted in a new political will to address some of these inequities in education and social services. Similarly, I would guess that almost everyone on this call has been aware of the racial injustices experienced by people and students and families of color in the US. But again, the entire country was not as aware of this. So the pandemic coincided with the national racial reckoning. After the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and a host of others, we experienced protests, right, in 50 states, 150 cities, and I think it's over 60 countries, in fact. So as part of this reckoning, billions of dollars have been pledged and committed by foundations and corporations to improve the outcomes of BIPOC communities. Legislation is now funneling resources to these historically redlined and marginalized neighborhoods. And so we have to use this opportunity where we've got political will, financial capital, social good to better support our students. So the question is, how do we do this, right? How do you move from this theoretical framework that we've been listening to actual concrete actions? So the Education Redesign Lab, they've created these 10 different principles that are listed here that all we believe when put together and customized per community can result in success. So equitable, comprehensive, student-centered, relationship-driven, personalized, actionable, cross-sector, information-driven, secure, and sustainable. So we want to move these away from just words. Oops, sorry. And so we're going to zoom into 5 of these principles and hear from some of the partners that were listed on the slide that Paul shared, where we're going to hear how they actually operationalize these 5 principles, 5 of the 10. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over to Jaspel, who's going to play a video.
Success planning has been one of our primary strategies for understanding what the individual needs and strengths are of our students, and especially students who fall into subgroups or maybe underrepresented and underserved, and then creating tailored solutions and resources to both capitalize on those strengths and meet those individualized needs. That really is the heart of equity work, and success planning has been a core strategy for getting there. It empowers students and families with information about both where their strengths are and ensures that we're building our work through an asset lens, but then also equips them with direct connections to resources and services that are tailored to meet their unique needs as well. But it's our students who are of color, who are economically disadvantaged, living in rural poverty, English language learners. They're the ones who are really facing barriers to those really important success milestones. And what we've learned in our district is that 70% of our students who are tested fall in some sort of subgroup. So understanding what their unique strengths and needs are, it's not just the moral and the right thing to do, but it's imperative to moving our district and our overall student body forward.
In Louisville, we've been able to leverage just so many different resources from so many different sectors. We've really worked through the paradigm of cross-sector collaboration, which rests on sort of three tenets. One is the identification of a sector failure. So something has gone wrong in the community. You have to really acknowledge that. Two is addressing the kind of collaborative structures, the trust building activities, how we're going to work together. And then the third part is really the communication of public value. Is really important for that third piece, because when you elevate what the need is, you provide individuals a chance to plug in where they maybe previously thought that they could not. And the rapid response group is comprised of the superintendent of the school district, folks from the mayor's office, the United Way, their impact leadership, several key nonprofits. And so it's all talking about it together, really begin to elevate the needs that we were all hearing from our individual constituencies. What I think has really allowed everyone to do is to realize that they don't have to be everything to everyone. We can really tap into the expertise of a wide variety of sectors and organizations to say, what does everybody bring to the table?
I got into this profession because I wanted to make a real difference in children's lives. And I've been very proud of my career all the way up through. But this ISSP thing really, to me, has taken it to a different level. It's made me an even more impactful teacher. I've heard from kids, students, that they say how helpful it's been. And wow, I feel more confident as I'm about to head off to high school. And at the junior high level, we also really are trying to kind of train them to be assertive and speak up for themselves. And so we do a lot of discussion around that as well. Having gone through this process now for a couple of years, it feels like a collaboration with the student, like a teamwork thing. We're working together. When I actually get to sit down with them and have that back and forth, you really get to know them as a person, as a student, and really just what makes them tick, so that you can, provide everything they need as best as you can. I'm seeing kids growing as learners. They are taking more ownership for themselves, and they look at us teachers not as the authority and that sort of thing, but hey, we're going to work on this together, and I'm going to grow with you. It's just such an empowering thing to see.
As you're looking to build relational trust, a lot of it is through your actions and not just your words. Some of these families I've known that are in fourth grade since they were in kindergarten. And so a lot of my supports for them have happened over the years through different situations, different stressors. And so in my support and my follow through, that trust has been built. The COS team really comes together as a community of leaders who say, okay, with all these touch points and relationships that we know to have with the student, how can we come together creatively to make sure that their needs are lifted up and supported? And so in that meeting, we are really eliciting feedback from different school systems that are supporting, but also different relationships. So what is the teacher seeing that the student is experiencing? What is the therapist seeing? Does this student receive academic supports, and what are they saying? And is the student in after school? What's their soccer coach thinking of? It really is a full interdisciplinary team. So looking at not what's just happening now, but what has happened for this student over the years. And we can really follow that student to make sure that the supports are very specific to them, and then even creative.
I think success planning creates an opportunity to start reinvigorating the social safety net at the student and household level. What that allows you to do is to reveal strengths and needs and be precise and targeted about what those are for students and families, so that you can respond in kind. Ultimately, it allows us to improve both our in-school and out-of-school ecosystems. Our Poughkeepsie Children's Cabinet, we have set a common vision for our community, where we want all children to have equitable access and opportunities and outcomes. We want everyone to reach their full potential and thrive. And so a personalized approach really allows us to realize that vision. For any discipline or pursuit that you can think of that we as humans engage in, there's individualized needs to allow anyone to reach a higher level. A personalized approach allows us to do that for children in Poughkeepsie, to ensure that people thrive, that they can pursue lives of consequence, that they can have access to a living wage, that they can pursue their passions, that they can be thoughtful and lifelong engaged citizens.
So through those videos, you had a chance to hear from specific communities how powerful the success planning approach has been for them already. And they represent various stages of the process, various amounts of time they've been implementing this. And I think you started to get a sense of the different types of approaches that different communities are taking for this. We're fortunate to have 3 of those stars of our videos with us, so you'll have a chance to ask them questions if you'd like about some of the specifics, in addition to asking Karen and others of us anything during the Q&A. We just wanted to point out before we get to that we do have a number of materials and resources on our website. We have been conducting research, creating tools, and developing a range of materials to support communities as they move through this process. And you can find those on our website at edredesign.org. We will also be holding additional webinars. This is intended as your first introduction for many of you to success planning. The subsequent ones, which will be coming in the next months, will explore more of the nuts and bolts of success planning. We'll explore issues such as who should serve as the navigator, what kind of training should they have to be successful in those roles, who supports the navigators, what kinds of data platforms might you either develop yourselves or or incorporate into your work to support the success planning effort. And we'll be following up with an email that includes links to a number of our resources, and we'll also have a link to this webinar video so that you can share it with other colleagues who might not have been able to attend. And now I will turn it back to Daniela, who will moderate the Q&A for us.
Excellent. Thank you, Lynn. I'm going to stop sharing so you can see everybody's faces. Hopefully that worked. And again, please submit questions in the Q&A as they come up. But one of the first ones that came, and I think it's probably best for Charles, Rob, and Nicole from our communities, is how are the needs of families taken into account in this framework? I don't know who wants to start, but I feel like you guys are all actively engaging families and students as well.
Yeah, I can start. So engaging families, I think it goes back to that community, city, systems level support, and then relational support, right? So like through the pandemic, vaccination sites, signing them up for vaccines, getting them connected at a city level. I'm the coordinator for our food bank site, and building, capacity for families to participate. And then now families lead our on-site food bank that happens 2 times a month, right? So that's kind of some of how we bring partners in at a city and community level. But then individually, if I see a family walk up and they have an infant, I might start talking to them about play therapy groups. Those children are not yet at my school, but we're offering services to the entire family, building capacity for the adults to actually have time to maybe work, helping them provide references, bringing them in so that they can participate and learn in developmental play groups. So they really are looking at not just the student that's on campus, but how we can provide support to the whole family and then elicit a lot of feedback. Is this what you need? Like, I don't typically just assign services to families or say, hey, this is what we're providing, but really lots of rapid feedback surveys saying, hey, what is our community needing this month? Where do we want to go? And I think that really builds trust with families because they feel like we're asking and we're receiving what we're asking for. And I think that that's huge, at least in East Oakland, for our families, making sure that their voice is really lifted up. So then they want to give feedback more often, right? When I say what I need, action happens. So that's some stuff that we're doing.
Thanks, Nicole. Robert, Charles, do you have other thoughts on how to engage the families or address family need?
I can jump in. So in the city of Poughkeepsie, New York, we're actually starting a new pilot for success planning in Poughkeepsie Middle School this coming fall with an organization called City Connects, housed at the Lynch School of Education at Boston College. And within this practice, we're going to have an individualized dashboard for each child. And one of the key domains of that dashboard is family engagement. So the idea is that we have access to household level data and needs and strengths in real time, and that we can use a permanent City Connects coordinator in the school to collaborate with partners across the community, including our local children's cabinet, which is a backbone organization. So really, this is about creating a permanent infrastructure. We hear that word a lot now nationally, a permanent civic infrastructure to engage family and community and each child, much like we have a medical record, would have a dashboard for them to see how they can engage in their families. And then the school system, we're going to be working with them in our cabinet around having a permanent way to engage families year round with staff and supports, but having that system, that success plan where we go back to that and we get to use that and update it in real time and do referrals and track engagements, learn about how families evolve, learn what families can contribute to the school's best practices and community best practices is critical. And I think that's something for far too long we haven't had institutionalized in our community.
Great. So a next question, Karen, this one's for you, is what conditions do you see as necessary for putting success planning in place? And I'd say at all the different levels that you have, right? From the individual to the school to the community, what do you feel are those conditions?
Yeah, I think the first condition, and it was just exemplified in the video in the chat so far, is really just a change in mindset. That really sort of suggests that success, first of all, is broader than just academic success. That zooms in to say, if we're really helping a young person become successful, this is a combination of supporting a broad set of competency development, giving them a sense of agency, which all of you talked about, middle school, how do we really sort of make sure young people are really getting that sense of agency that they can do things themselves? And as you just said, around, especially we're working with BIPOC young people, really getting that sense of identity. And getting that sense of identity is really important. So we first have to have a common, broader definition of what success is. I think the second thing that's important, and it goes to your first question about families, is recognizing and being really careful to make sure that we're bringing an asset framework in, even as we're working with families that we assume may need access to basic services. So if we come into this conversation thinking what we have to do is help families connect to basic services so that they can get their kids to school so that we can help their kids learn, we're coming in again with a mindset that sort of bifurcates and puts families over here in just sort of you get the kid fed and clothed and we teach them. What we just had some amazing data just come out from an organization called Learning Heroes that does interviews and big surveys of families. And I'll figure out how to drop it in the chat for you. But that really just came out last week. And they interviewed parents and surveyed parents, teachers, and frontline youth organization staff, sort of after school, out of school community organization staff, to find out what they were doing, but to also just basically ask, when you think about the things that young people need to have in terms of those skills and competencies, how do you differentiate between where they get them? And I think that kind of understanding is really important. So we're not just sort of mapping what are the services families need, but how does each family with their young person talk about what those characteristics are that make that young person likely to be successful? What are those competencies and skills that they want them to build, and how do they talk about them? And where do they see them getting them? And what's interesting is that families were really quite clear about the differentiation between the kind of skills and competencies they were working on at home, what they expected to be sort of focused on in school, which is really sort of content development, make sure you were disciplined, problem solving, focusing on a problem, and then the kind of rich exploration stuff they want to happen in that category that you called enrichment activities. So I would say that there are many things we can talk about how the coordination levels need to be there so that once you get navigators in place, they aren't spending all their time, with the virtual phone book looking for things, but they can go up and find things. But for me, it's this mindset that really brings an asset-based approach in and starts in that conversation of what are the skills and competencies you want your young person to have? Or if you're talking to a middle and high school kid, what are you trying to build? Where are you finding it? How can we help you get more? So that they're really being brought into the conversation and then figuring out how to make those broader connections. And the last thing I'll say in terms of being ready is and again, this was in the video, think about those navigators as being in multiple places. So yes, they clearly can be in schools. Yes, we clearly want teachers to really sort of take on that whole child approach, but we've also just got a lot of other people in the building who know your kids and may have time and may have different kinds of relationships. You go back to that blue wheel, they may be coming at that from a different perspective. It's not academic instruction that may give them more insight. So I would say, let's really make sure as we're deciding that we're going to be ready to tackle this, that you take both an asset-based approach, but you also really take the time to map and think about all the assets that you have and how they're going to be connected.
Thanks, Karen. And that's a perfect segue to one of the questions that actually just came in about what expertise do navigators need to fulfill their role and how many students are supported by a single navigator? Because the job seems really broad in scope with high potential for impact. And I'm not sure if it should be from the field or Lynn, I know you've been doing a lot of research and Paul on the actual skill sets of navigators, and it can be a teaser for the subsequent webinars to come. So maybe Lynn, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, we've been thinking a lot about the role of navigators, and one thing that we're seeing as different communities implement this approach is that they envision the navigator role in a lot of different ways very successfully. So, just to follow up on exactly what Karen was just saying, in Nashville, they have deployed a wide range of personnel who have interactions with students already to serve as navigators. So those include bus drivers, they include lunch workers and custodians, as well as teachers and paraprofessionals. So they're really thinking about who already might know the kids and be able to build on those relationships. Of course, then you need training and you need certain dispositions and high comfort level with interacting with kids. So it's not, people can't just turn around and step into this role without any support or training. We do have a guide that we've put up with some resources on our website, and we'll make sure to share that with you in the follow-up email, because you do need cultural competency. You need comfort talking to kids. And importantly, you also need a support system to back you up. So the navigator is really, it's, that connector with the kids. We don't expect the navigator, unless you're actually using trained counselors already as your navigators, to be in a position to address mental health challenges that kids or families are facing, or to be able to provide the services themselves. What they do is filter the information to those who then can put it in practice. So that's really important, is, this is the touch point with the kids and families. And then there are other people who are going to be able to take the ball and run with it.
Thanks, Lynn. And actually, that makes me think, Charles, I'm going to direct the next question to you in terms of how that navigator is able to connect to different services. Because somebody asked, how do you account for HIPAA privacy laws when connecting to all aspects of a child's life? I wonder if you can touch a little bit on the United Community Data Platform and sort of the way that you can use technology to do some of those pieces.
Sure. So in the Louisville community, we have a partnership that was spearheaded by the local United Way. And as you mentioned, it's called United Community, that is an offshoot of an organization called Unite Us. It's a national organization. And so really what it does is what Rob was speaking about earlier, is it takes all these various needs from a variety of different sectors, and it's really a no wrong door solution. So typically, if you think about like a community center, and there's a community center director, and Charles walks in, and Charles is here to play basketball, but we also know that Charles is maybe experiencing food insecurity. That community center director might not know where to put Charles or where to direct Charles, but he can log on to United Community and say, hey, I have a student here, Charles, who is here for some enrichment activities, but also his family is experiencing food insecurity. And so that referral shoots out into the ether. And so anybody who deals with food insecurity, any agency will get that referral for Charles and his family. So someone can take that referral, and they have 48 hours to respond to that referral. And if they don't, it goes back into the queue. But once they accept that referral, they can go out and say, hey, Charles, I'm, such and such with this agency. How can I help your family? And so the response time in other communities has really been cut by a week and a half, because it's not picking up the yellow pages, although I guess we don't have yellow pages anymore, but it's not, searching all over the internet hoping to get a right solution. That the handoff between, your agency and the partner agency is the right connection, and they are doing the connection. So it's not incumbent upon the child or the family to make that handoff. The organization is taking that child or that family by the hand and saying, how can we help you? So it's been really a game changer in our community just to make those connections in a more intentional way.
Thanks, Charles. And I think you may have mentioned it, but those platforms then have built in the different privacy and permissions because people have to sign, the organizations have to sign.
Yes, there's consent.
Permissions.
There's multiple ways to obtain consent. They are both HIPAA and FERPA compliant. And of course, there's a number of data sharing agreements that need to be facilitated between the district and the city and United Way and things of that nature. But again, it's that collaborative structure that allows everybody to come around the table and really say, what do we need to make this happen, and remove those barriers in turn, we can't until we can.
Thanks, Charles. So we actually have 3 questions that are very similar and different aspects of the barriers and obstacles that communities have faced trying to launch success planning, both because there's all these do's and don'ts from teachers' perspective, and the school districts have their certain way of doing things, as well as the funding. So it's kind of a broad question, but can maybe our 3 communities, or even Paul, you've got the national perspective, or Karen, you've been doing this for a while, what are some of the obstacles to get these started and solutions for those? I feel like you all have different pieces to that, so I don't know who to assign it to first.
Well, I'll jump in and take the funding piece, because I think we're in an amazing moment right now with the American Rescue Plan and all the federal funds coming down to do the upfront spending, to create the framework, the platforms, the training, maybe to add some of the additional personnel, and to have a few years while this funding holds out to prove the value of this so that it can be sustained in the long run. I think this is one of the bright spots that, a lot of us are apprehensive with so much money coming down that it be spent well, and that the examples that get celebrated are not misfeasance and malfeasance, but extraordinary success that has results. I think success planning is one place where we can prove that this money can be spent in a way that really makes a difference. And the expenses are not that substantial. It is true, districts will have to add some personnel. They will have to do training across the board for everybody who gets involved in this. They will have to put up platforms. Communities will. Maybe typically it will happen through the school system, so there'll be some of that. But once you get that up and going, once you stand that up, it should develop a momentum of its own. So that's one of the chief obstacles that people would have thrown up in other times to say, this is sounds like a great idea, but we'll never have the resources to do it. Now we have the resources to do it.
And I'll just say, in our community, though the pandemic was and has been really a challenge, it was really a boon for us, because Paul actually wrote an article where he talked about it really drains the ocean, and we got to see the ocean floor. Our biggest obstacle was that everybody told us, "Oh, all these connections exist. We don't need this. We know the United Way. We know these nonprofits. We know the Boys and Girls Club." But when everything shut down, we really got to see that these connections really did not exist. And so we pulled people together to say, what is it that you are really trying to solve for? And so, as the question said, I think part of it is that we don't talk about, everybody has a need, but they're not necessarily the same need. So if you think about like an orange, and both of us want an orange, you might say, well, the solution for us both to have an orange is to cut it in half. But really, if we ask more questions, you might need the orange peel just to make like a candle or some soap or something, and I want the fruit to eat. So we both can have what we want if we just talk about what it is that we actually need. And so for school systems, because the district was shut down, they needed connection points with kids. Nonprofits had the kids connections who were coming to them, but they just didn't have the academic component. And so when we finally sat down and talked to each other, it was like, oh, we all have pieces of what each other needs. And so that really begins to build out this network that's not based on scarcity, and we have to take something from each other, but we all have things to bring to the table that can really begin to support this whole child: enrichment, connections, academic support, social emotional support, supporting food insecurity. And that's really what has been the biggest driver, really jumping into this space during a time of really uncertainty.
Yeah, I think too, There's some flexibility. I think there's some core tenets to the role of the coordinator or the navigator, whatever the title is. But I think the background, like I have more of a mental health background, whereas some of the other navigators or coordinators may have a community organizing background. And so really being flexible to look at site needs and what the community is looking for in the coordinator. And also really keep, I've been with my community since 2017 at the same site. So I've seen some of these kids grow up. And I think that that really helped us in the pandemic as well, where they really needed to lean on our Department of 45 because of the relationships with, community organizations, but also just with the families, deeply connected with their extended family. And so I do think that flexibility with who does the role and their background coming into the role is huge, site by site.
I guess I would just jump in and get back to that word relationships, and mention one word that I haven't heard us say, which is time. This is all going to be driven by having as many people as possible take time to get to know kids and families and ask them a broad set of questions. And then once you and we know that in every organization, when we're looking at schools, communities, there are people who do that. What we're doing is now saying that's critically important, that's intentional, we want to build that in. And then it's a huge responsibility once you've taken the time to ask the questions and find out both what the assets are and what the needs are. Your responsibility is now, what do I do with this information? That's where the tools come in, that's where the technology comes in, that's where the more formal things come in. But I would just say one barrier to getting this stuff started, when we think about how do we start it and get to scale, we often go to the top and say we have to put the technology in place, we have to put the tools in place, and we over formalize it. And then it doesn't get back down to, you have to take the time to get to know the kids and families, have some organized way of making sure you're getting that 360 view that you talked about. And then the people, get as many people as possible, understanding that they're coming from different perspectives. Use any tool you can to make sure that this is the person that they're coming at this because they have a deep relationship. They're coming at this because they've got access to services. They're coming at this because they can provide instructional support or mental health, know what they can bring, but get them in there and get them started. And then really sort of let it push outward. And I think we had more time, I'd give you a couple of great anecdotes. We have examples of where when we've recruited people who have time and have relationships and want to build on those relationships, that pushes up to tell you what the needs are and where the gaps are, in a way that if we just start analyzing it up here, we don't always get down.
Danielle, just a quick anecdote to piggyback on what Karen's just said, and to a point that was raised in one of the questions, which is, how do teachers relate to this, and contracts and do's and don'ts and standard operating procedures. My experience, for example, in Unity Point, we have one of the teachers in the video from Unity Point, was really powerful in this regard. I was on a panel with a couple of teachers, and one of them said, okay, we've set up to do this individualized planning, and I made a set of appointments for all my students in my homeroom, and I allowed about 8 minutes for each one to do the debriefing and so forth. And she said, well, I got into it, and then actually an hour and a half later, I was still talking and listening. And this turned out to be the most satisfying time I've ever had with a student. And it went on to lead to all sorts of, outcomes that you heard the teacher testifying to himself. And so I went to the superintendent afterwards, and this was a very unionized district in which they'd had a lot of problems. I said, with this dedication from time, because they hadn't added personnel, they hadn't added time to the schedule. I said, have you had grievances or problems with people doing this? And she said, absolutely none, because the teachers say what you heard that teacher say. The value proposition in this for teachers is, this is why I went into this work in the first place, to have deep relationships and have an impact on the lives of children. And this is making it happen. So I'm all for this and embracing it. Obviously, structurally, we need to build in time so they have the time to do it. Now we have the resources to do that. But I think there's a real win-win here. The teachers and others who get involved in this work will embrace.
Thanks, Paul, and for Karen for closing us out, I think, and really focusing on the root values that have to drive this work. I know in this current world, everyone is back to back to back to back Zooms and cameras. So thank you for everybody who's participated, both the participants and the questions and our panelists here. And look forward to sending out the emails and the slides and then hopefully seeing you on subsequent webinars. So have a wonderful afternoon, morning, depending on where you are signing in from.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.